and then time of discussion. So let's see. View slideshow. There we go. And once again, not quite sure why I'm not getting full screen. But I won't find it. Okay, so we're doing this series on sharing the gospel this year. And in order to share the gospel with our neighbors, co-workers, we kind of need to understand the culture in which they're coming from. So we're doing this cultural study. And what we noted was that the very core ideology of our culture would be individualism. So that's the core, and out of this core, it generates secondary beliefs or assumptions. And we define this, hopefully you have this memorized by now or get of it, but the individualism is the belief that we are our own. I own myself and all things in relation to myself. And then the primary calling is to be responsible for the meaning of my life. And the meaning would include both my sense of identity, purpose, and calling. And basically all that revolves around who I am. I'm responsible for that. And then out of the individualism, there are a number of, so authenticity, be true to yourself, freedom, ability to choose, tribalism, consumerism, and a therapeutic culture. So there are 5 things there. And what we're doing for the next 5 weeks, so today we're doing freedom, and then for the next 5 weeks, we'll do each one of these, and that'll I'll close out this section on understanding our culture. And then afterwards,
they're just laughing at it that they can't see the word.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how to get this full screen, so I have to figure that one out. Yeah. And then after this series, we're doing 2 more parts. One on theological issues concerning evangelism, and there'll be a sermon preached on it. And then in Sunday school, we're going to go deeper than what we present in the sermon. So that's the second part. And then the third part is common objections that when you share the gospel, common objections that people give. There's 7 of them that we'll look at. And once again, we'll preach a sermon on that. And then on Sunday school, we'll go deeper. So it'll be connected. Okay. And so if you give me about 25 minutes or so, freedom is of the highest value in individualism. Without freedom, you cannot have individualism. And so that's an assumption. Whether you believe you're truly free or not, in reality, there's a number of issues involved. At least you have to believe that you are free in order for individualism to take off. So if you have here, we are our own, that's the fundamental belief. The responsible part, unless you have freedom of choice, your ability to choose, you cannot be responsible for the meaning of your life. Responsibility suggests or implies a level of freedom where you can develop who you are and reach the potential of. So responsibility is the ability to respond. That's, if you broke the word apart, ability to respond. Freedom is implied in responsible action, so that it is not accidental, right? So that the action that you are doing is not accidental, merely random, and it is not forced, but rather it's born within you and it is expressed outward. In that sense, it is a responsible act. And then freedom, there are a number of ways to try to define freedom, but we're going to define it just as ability to do otherwise, so that there are more than one option, competing options, and you have the ability to choose one, but you choose the other because of various reasons that are embedded within you. It's not accidental and it's not forced. Okay, so if you have an individual that's making a career choice, whether to be a doctor or a fireman, so they choose, they're responsible for their choice. Which profession is truest to ability, desire, calling in her life? You choose to be a doctor, but you could have chosen. That's the ability to do otherwise. Without that inserted there, it's not really responsible freedom. So the second one would be, let's say for her, she wants to get married or she wants to stay single. In this choice as well, if she decides to be a single, that choice is a responsible choice as long as the decision rests within her and that she has certain motivations or reasons within to make that choice. And then for 2024 coming up, and if you're trying to vote for a president, I left both of them dotted because I did not want anyone to suggest I was implying one or the other. So, but the potentiality rests that she will vote either for Republican or Democrat, and the choice is there. This ability to choose in poetic form, and I think most of us have heard this type of the poem here, two roads diverge in a yellow wood, and sorry, I could not travel both and be one traveler long. I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. This is one of the when making choice between two options, if you could see how they ended up, it'd be so easy, right, to make the choice, but we can't, and that's the risk. Every choice we make is a risk that you do not experience where the alternative path would have led you down to. So to think of all the major decisions that you made in life, when you look back, the significance of the choice is that the alternative could have led you to a very different path. You could have been a different career, different geographic area, perhaps single, perhaps married, or married to someone else. But we do not have the ability to look down that path, and that's where the risk is involved. A couple things real quick on choice. For something to be chosen, well, usually more than one option. Usually there's more than one option. So I have the basketball up there because it still rings in my memory. I was a youth pastor for 3 years out in California, and the junior high kids would go out and play basketball, and sometimes they invite me to come along, and I feel like it's my pastoral duty, so I would go out. And then they always pick teams. I don't know why. So the two kids come up, and then they start picking teams, and I'm not very coordinated on the basketball court. In fact, I've broken more glasses on the basketball court. And I remember this one time they were picking teams, and the number's shrinking. I'm still standing there, and then I'm the very last one there. This is the horror of every nerd. And one of the team captain whose choice it was next, what he says is, "I choose Pastor Rim." And in my thought, I just wanted to say, that's not a choice. You're stuck with me. Because usually it requires more than one option, right? So that's in life, it's the multiple options that we have. The one that we choose, it's significant because the reasons behind the choice, that's what makes us responsible for the choice, because you made the choice. And then secondly, something to be chosen well, one goes through an intentional process. So, there are different personalities. There's some personalities where you get a choice and, you just go with the emotions. It's a very emotional person or intuitive person. And then there are other kinds of individuals, when they have a choice, they spend days just going through the list. My daughters express both extremes. So I have a daughter named Rachel who just loves to try new things. And when there's a choice, she just goes like this. And I wonder, have you thought about it? And then my other daughter takes days to make simple decisions. And my wife and I, we talk about her, a good bit, how we wish we could take the two daughters and put them in a bottle and just shake them up. And that would be perfect. But usually for a choice to be well made, there is some intentional reflection that should go on. And obviously, the more significant the decision, the more intentional and reflection there should be. And then interestingly, for something to be chosen well, there should be no external constraints. There should be no pressure. So I think all parents are guilty of trying to help our kids to make good choices, and we put subtle pressures upon them so that they kind of lean in the right direction. And, it's one of the skills of parenting is to give wisdom without that subtle subconscious pressure to go one direction over another, because we want their choices to be born from within them rather than the external constraints. And then lastly, and this is an interesting point, the one final point, the more discipline, greater your options. The more I restrict my freedom, the more freedom I have. So that if an individual is involved in practicing the piano and they restrict their options of all the things they could do to playing the piano, later in life, they have the freedom, the ability to play piano. So that teaching our kids discipline, in other words, restrict your freedom so that later in life you have more freedom. That's what we tell our kids. You study hard, you study hard. You can always be a garbage collector. This is from my sermon weeks ago, if you remember. Yeah, so, you can always be a garbage collector, but if you go to college, you have multiple options. This is one of the things we tell our kids. The more prepared you are, the greater the number of options from which you can choose. And then the flip side of it is, more options. So if you're learning French, and then you can speak French as well. But the flip side, less discipline, less options. This is how I understand addiction. So that if you do not have discipline with alcohol, with gambling, or any other addictive behavior, then what happens is the range of possible actions are delimited to the point, if you're addicted enough, you don't really have a choice. Biological, neurological factors have kicked in. It has squeezed out the psychological factors so that you may actually need external restraint to get out of that particular addiction. So less discipline, you have less options. So keeping this in mind, freedom is the main value within our culture. There are two kinds of freedom. So the negative freedom and positive freedom. So that it's a positive and negative liberty. And I'm getting this from Isaiah Berlin, who specializes in this type of understanding of freedom. So that negative freedom is freedom from interference by other people. So it's there's no external constraint or form of oppression where you are forced to decide or do what you are doing. And then positive freedom is the possession of the power and resources to fulfill one's potential. In other words, you are free to make whatever decisions their passion or your desire leads you to without external constraint. These two are linked, but they're separable. You can experience negative freedom, but you may not really experience positive freedom. So hang on to that. So if you look here, negative freedom is freedom from constraint. So like a child being physically constrained. Let's say being blackmailed is a form of negative liberty because there's external pressure for you to do or think in certain ways that you may not want. And then obviously slavery is a form of negative freedom. So it's freedom from. And then positive freedom is freedom to do something. So the freedom to choose your religion, to worship, the freedom of speech, these two things guaranteed by our Bill of Rights, freedom to follow your passion. So what is your purpose in life? It's the freedom to follow it. It's to self-direct your life so that your life looks in a certain manner. You're like an author writing a book. Your life is your book. The choices are your words that you are using to write it. So freedom to. What kind of novel or book are you working on? So Isaiah Berlin says that in our culture, we focus on freedom. We don't focus on positive freedom. Injustice, poverty, slavery, ignorance, these may be cured by reform or revolution. So there's slavery, then you have war or rebellion, but men do not live by fighting evils alone. I love it. It's not just getting rid of negative liberty. You have to have something to live for. This is where individualism fails because it's primarily focused on negative liberty. They don't have enough resources to direct you to where you ought to go. Remember the illustration last week from a Braveheart. Remember Braveheart when Don Wallace, he's called and then they're torturing him. What's the very last word he says? Freedom. What kind of freedom is he talking about? He's not talking about positive liberty. He's talking about negative liberty, right? Freedom from constraint. But if you ask them, where should I go? What should I do with my life? Individualism doesn't have enough resources to give you a meaningful response. That's the critique that's going to be made. Third, and I only have 4 points. Individualism focuses more on negative freedom than positive freedom. So that if we look at America, and if I had one word to describe America, it would be freedom. We are about freedom. Negative freedom, not positive freedom. In fact, if I go to both Republicans and Democrats, I think both sides would agree on freedom, right? It's what to do with freedom. The positive side, where there may be disagreement. So that this is David Bentley Hart, and he says, modernity's highest ideal, and he means freedom by that. Modernity's highest ideal, that's freedom, requires us to place our trust in a fertile void. No grounds by which we decide what to do, which all things are possible, from which arises no impediments to our will, right? As long as nothing constrains my will, and before which we may consequently choose to make of ourselves what we choose. He's intentionally put it circular, because there's no grounding by which to make the decision. It is your choice, by your choice, and you know you made a good choice when it's based upon you. There's no external criteria to measure how well the choices are made. We trust, that is to say, that there is no substantial criterion by which to judge your choices. If I am an individualist and I make a choice, no one can come and tell me that's a good choice or bad choice. They can only ask me, were you true to yourself? In other words, you are grounding yourself in yourself. In Christian theology, only one being can ground their choices within their own being. That's God. All creation is grounded in God's will. Only God's will is grounded in God's will. In other words, God doesn't turn around to anyone else and say, hey, was that a good choice? Because the standard is himself. And that stand higher than the unquestioned good or free choice itself, and that therefore all judgment, divine no less than human. Right? Because you can have religious individualism, you can use God as one of the resources in your self-expression, is in some sense an infringement upon our freedom. In other words, if I come and judge Charles's decision for whatever, I'm impinging upon his freedom to choose. The only thing I can say to Charles is, Charles, were you true to yourself? Of which Charles can only decide that by looking into himself. So that this is the only basis for what a good choice is, to be true to oneself. So that we live in a world that constantly tells us what to do. Sorry, this is really getting smaller as the slides go. My apologies. I can't, I'm having trouble reading it. I'm up here. We live in a world that constantly tells us what to do, how to act, and what to be. Knowing how to be true to yourself and live the life you want can be a challenge, but this is true. Many of us want to be true to ourselves, but are afraid what others will react negatively towards us, and in extreme cases cancel us from social media because of offensive comments. We want the freedom to be able to express ourselves, make choices that reflect who we are, so that individualism, you grow when your choice is grounded in yourself. That's autonomy. In Christianity, it's the very opposite. Growth occurs through submission. The more I submit to God so that my choices align with his will, I'm growing. But in individualism, that's a form of denying who you are. In individualism, my choice must always be grounded in my will, which is grounded in my desire, which is grounded in and it's deeper and deeper within me. So that if you look here, to thine own self, let's say that's a motto of individualism. Well, in Christianity, the motto is not my will, but thine. It's dying to the self in Christianity that growth occurs. Whereas in individualism, it's the self-actualization of the self that causes growth. So that the heart argues, ultimately, look, for us, it is the choice of self and not what we choose. This is the first good. That's an individualism, because no one can judge from the outside. And then he has this, I like this quote. He says, look, when it comes to religion, so religious individualism, what happens is, at which religion has become indistinguishable from interior decorating. Right? In your religious life, you like that sofa, bring that in. You like that kind of kitchen, bring that in. But that's not religion. That's what word do we use for spiritual individualism? I said the word. It's spiritual. Remember, so I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. You heard that phrase? That's what it means. Harton is arguing, well, you pick and choose what you want. You don't like some parts of the creed, knock it out. You don't like some parts of what your church teaches, well, you can either switch your church shop or you can mix and match even though you go. Right? And in fact, a lot of people that go to church, they go to church because they like certain things. They don't like other things. There's no submission to the entirety of the community because that goes against your primary directive of self-actualization. Last point. Individualism is difficult to live out. I would argue impossible, but I'll be safe and say it's difficult to live out. And there are a couple of reasons why. The most difficult thing in life is to know yourself. It really is. Yeah, I need to know myself in order to make choices that are true to myself. But self-knowledge is extremely difficult. I think even as we get older, it's difficult to know ourselves. In fact, there's psychological studies that show that other people know you better than you know yourself. There are studies where, what would you do if someone came up and begged you for money and you make you give an answer, and then they ask your three friends. Your three friends have a tendency of being more accurate about who you are than your answer about yourself, because you want to see yourself in a certain way. There's a lot of self-deception going on in self-introspection. In fact, if you want to know me better, don't come and ask me. Just buy my wife lunch and it'll all pour out. But it is. And now individualism, which is focused mainly on the younger generation, but if you take a kid that's 18, 17, 16, 14 and ask, wow, you need to make choices that are true to yourself, the Disney movie audience. And at that age, you think they really know who they are? I think this is in fact, Calvin had it right. To know who you are, you have to know God first. That's your anchor. That's your anchor.
So who is it?
Oh, Calvin. And to know yourself, you have to know God. And from Augustine as well. In fact, the Christian tradition is that you never know yourself by looking at yourself because it's ungrounded. It's like a floating cloud. There's nothing to hold you up. But God is the foundation. He begins to tell you who you are. And out of that framework, you learn. But without that framework, it's just too much. It's like taking a little kid to, those like super candy stores out there and saying, pick what you want. And there's too many options. It's too hard. What do you really want? And most of the time when you come to my office, when I was teaching, and it's counseling or they have a personal life question, most of the time it's because they don't know what they want. They come and they ask me, how do I make the decision? If I don't know who I am or I don't know myself that well, how do I know what I want? Half of us don't know what we want. Well, a lot of our kids don't know what we want. And then too much freedom seems to change into nothing but too much slavery. That's Plato, right? Too much freedom. Too much freedom is a bad thing. That's just my personal opinion. Because when you have that many options, how are you going to make a meaningful choice and evaluate all of those options? Thank God I only had one woman who wanted to marry me, but if I had three women that wanted to marry me, can you imagine the stress? Sorry. That illustration just came to mind. So I thought, take a risk. Oh, Lord. Let's keep going. Did you know that when you go to it's gotten progressively harder to go and buy in the supermarket? Before milk was just, whole milk, 1% and 2%. Now I go to the milk aisle and there's like 7 or 8 different kinds of milk, and each kind of milk, there are variations within. And I didn't know you could milk some of those things, which they have milk for. But it's not just milk, it's salad dressing, it's peanut butter, it's everything.
Another plug for Costco, since from
Yes.
the reason Costco is so successful is they only offer you 1 or 2 options of items.
Yes. I think there's an intentionality involved in that. That's right. Another one for Costco. But the problem is that the more choices, you're actually unhappy. See, this is unintuitive, non-intuitive, you would think, wow, the more choices, the better, right? That's great. So you go to Disneyland, and if they have 1,000 rides, you're like, oh, look at all the 1,000 rides that I can ride on. But the problem is that when you go to Disneyland and look at the 1,000 rides, 1,000 lines, yes, the lines. I was reading a news article of a father who took his 3 kids to Disneyland and said he'll never go back because they got on like 4 rides the whole day, even when they paid for the speedy thing. So, but more choices, you're actually unhappy. So that this is the paradox of choice. So that you want positive freedom. Of course, you don't want to be negative. And then you don't want just one choice, you want a couple choices, but there's a maximum here where once you hit those couple choices, it goes downhill, and the more choices you have, at some point you become dissatisfied with the number of choices that you have. Why? Reason number 1, it creates paralysis. If there are 1,000 rides in Disneyland, if there are 25 variations of milk, for me to make an intentional choice, I should look at all the different kinds of milk and I should study up, right? Which milk is the healthiest for my family and all. But when you have that many options, I don't know which to choose. So that they did a study on jam. So, like in front of Costco or Walmart, and they set up these tables of jam sampling. So it was, see, which jam do you like best was the question, but they wanted to see how many people would buy jam that they liked. And what they found was that when there were 24 jams in one and 6 jam in a different study, that the shoppers that had more jam to choose from, they sampled 2, only 3% bought. But the less options, they sampled 2, greater percentage, but 30% bought. In other words, it's so many choices. How do you know you're making the right one? So you don't make a choice. But the less options, the more that they are prone to making the choice and living it out. The second one is opportunity cost. So if there are a lot of choices, and I thought, how do I know I made the right choice? You do the background study and you go through your research. But once you make the choice, there's a buyer's remorse. How do you know you make the right choice? I mean, if there's only one option, you can't really go back and say, I should have made the other choice, right? And so what we have here is a buyer's remorse. 75% of home buyers admit that they regret their home purchase. 75%. That's a lot. The top regret was buying a home that needed more work than expected. And then nearly half of those polled wished they had searched for longer. And here's the thing. When my wife and I, we were buying a house, the longer we searched, the more we got tired of all the options. So paralysis is kicking in. And then we narrowed it down to 2 homes, a condo and a townhome. Bought the condo. We have conversations about once a month on how maybe we should have bought the townhome. Because we had, 30, 40 different options. We're finally able to narrow it down. And then we had 2 that was viable and workable. And we went with the condo, but the opportunity cost of what it could have been, And so you're looking at the pros and cons, but did I make the right choice? The less options you have, the less opportunity cost, and then expectations increase. This is an interesting one. So, before, gene is gene, right? You buy a gene. Now there are like 20 different variations of genes. The more options you have, the more you think one of the options ought to fit you perfectly. So that the level of expectation increases so that this is just for me. In fact, that the more options, the more individualized, the more this will be perfect for me. So that you have an increased expectation of how it should fit you, but it's never perfect. So that you end up blaming yourself for the choice. We blame ourselves. Now that we have a dog, we don't have a backyard. Man, we should have bought that townhome. True story. This month, they raised the association fee on the condo. My first thought was, we should have bought the townhome. I don't know how many times. And then every time I say we should have, I look at, man, how stupid can you be? Right? That's the most expensive investment you're going to make. And how do you make such a dumb choice? And then, Huh? And what and what happens is, as we blame ourselves, we don't like what we have that God has given. How many people in the world would love to live in our townhome? Oh, a lot. And yet we live in regret because of the self-blame of what we did. And it's sort of like at the restaurant. You know, you got all these options, right? I should get a restaurant that only gives you 2 options. Costco, right? Hot dog. Wonderful, you know, what opportunity cost? Just buy both, right?
Less than $5.
Less than $5. But you ever been at a restaurant and you get this long menu and you're like, which one? And then you pick one and you think, oh, you know, I should have. And then what my wife does is she goes to the bathroom the long way. She goes around all the tables. And she makes the choice, and then she goes and looks at all the other food and thinks, I should have bought, I should have ordered. And then the food comes out, and then she's not grateful for what she has. And then she goes, honey, let's pray for the food. And we'll pray to God. Thank you, Lord, for the food that we. Well, we do it in restaurants, and we can laugh about it. Homes, it's a lot harder. But there are decisions in career, relationships. And too much choice can become imprisoning, and it can result in self-blame. So that when our kids look at all the career options and you ask a 3rd grader, what do you want to be when you grow up? But you know, 200 years ago, you just followed your father. You don't have to worry. So yeah, I don't want to live in a world where I don't have any choice, but a world in which there are so many choices. Now, this one next slide is a little controversial. I hope not. But it does bother me a lot that when celebrities come out and tell me their kids, when they're 14 years old, know that they're transgender. I'm like, they don't even know who they are. How do they know they're transgender? And then here, 3-year-old, I know she was trans, she was just 3 years old. You're placing that kind of responsibility on a kid that young. And this is extreme illustration, I realize that, but it does illustrate the point. You don't want to give too much freedom, right? Not too much freedom. And so without sufficient grounds for making choices, with the proliferation of options, freedom can become a curse. It has become a curse. In fact, a lot of our teenagers don't make decisions because of their individual desire. They make it because everyone else makes it. And the social media has enabled that to occur. I'm sorry, I do have one more point. Christianity calls for freedom of submission. And I want to give the balanced side to this so that, you know, we're studying Romans, and I hope you're enjoying our short survey of Romans. But Romans has the word freedom twice, actually 3 times, but we're going to work with these 2. This is freedom and freedom there, Romans 6, Romans 8, but it's got a footnote because the word free here is not free, it's justified. So whenever you read Romans and it says justified by faith, that's the same word here. You are justified by faith. In other words, God has set you free from the bondage of sin. Now, the word free here is free in the sense of you are free to make decisions. So that you must be justified first so that you are free in Christ to live out. But live out in such a way that you submit to God, not actualize who you are. So if you look at the freedom, Romans 6, this comes from Chuck Swindoll, and I heard this. I used to deliver Domino's Pizza when I was in college, and I listened to the sermons of Chuck Swindoll, John MacArthur, and I remember this illustration while I was delivering a pizza, and it just stuck with me. He said, Romans 6 freedom is Emancipation Proclamation. It's declarative, it's forensic, it's illegal, so that the slaves were freed in Romans 6, Emancipation Proclamation, but they didn't experience freedom. They didn't experience freedom until the struggle and the war, which set them free. So that only after the war, slaves who were unfree become free in such a way that they were not just forensically free, but experientially free. Romans 6 is about forensic. Romans 8 is about experiencing the liberty of that freedom that God has given. Then that that freedom isn't designed for your own self-actualization, as we saw last week. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and present your members to God as instruments of righteousness. As much as you were enslaved to sin before, now be enslaved to God. Before, you didn't have a choice. Now you have a choice. It's willful submission. What imagery in the Old Testament is there for willful enslavement?
The Israelites begging to go back to Egypt, I guess.
Oh, what? So enslavement to God.
Yeah,
Enslavement.
no, enslavement to the wrong people.
Yeah. There you go. Have you sang the song? Pierce my ears, O Lord. When a slave that's set free loves the master, can willfully enslave themselves, what they do is they pierce the ear. Pierce the ear is the mark. The piercing is the mark of belonging. The ear is that I may hear and obey God, and the door opening to a brand new life. That's what God seeks in the gospel. Not that you will be free to live out your life for self-actualization, but to become slaves of righteousness, so that we may become instruments in the hands of God for his will, not just to be in heaven, but on earth. So, I look at things like, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That's only half the story of the gospel. You have to, at the other half, he sets you free so that you may enslave yourself to God. And because we don't have the second half, we have people running around thinking the gospel sets me free. It's for me. It's about me. It is and it isn't. It is for you so that you can re-enslave yourself to God. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. We love this verse, and I have a number of Google slides of this verse alone, but no one has Google slides of this. You're free, verse 5, to chapter 5. You are free so that you can slave yourself to your neighbors for the sake of demonstrating the love of God. So that the gospel is about freedom, but it's the freedom to have your years free so that you can be enslaved to God once again. So here's my point. When you're sharing the gospel in individualistic culture, you need that second part. You got to stress that. Yeah, God died for your sin. He loves you. He died, and he gave you his righteousness so that you may be free. So that the 4 spiritual laws needs a 5th law. So that you may enslave yourself to God. And if you don't enslave yourself to God, we're going to have to examine whether your faith is a genuine faith. Because true faith always leads to enslavement towards God. So this is done. So we'll look at 4 more in the next 4 weeks, except for Easter weekend. And which parts of the gospel should we stress in an individualistic culture? Yeah. All right, I'm done. Are there any thoughts or questions? If not, we can go out downstairs and.
No, let's spend a lot of time and together talking about what this really means or some questions.
Why don't you lead the discussion?
It's 2 points. I think one thing that what you said reminded me of, especially when you mentioned what if I had 3 different options of women to marry.
You remember that of all the illustrations.
Because I think a lot of new writing has come out on the effect that dating apps.
Yeah.
I think it's a
Perfect.
great example of
Yes.
how dating for young people has become a lot harder for a lot of young people, at least. I think for the top 10%, or according to whatever metric they want to use in terms of attractiveness or social standing or whatever, the top 10% have their pick of the litter or whatever. But for so many people, because the options are, instead of being able to date the few people that you went to school with or you go to work with, now you can literally date anybody within whatever distance radius that you can choose. And it has become so much harder for a lot of people. And especially if you are considered in the bottom percentile, according to whatever metric that they have, it becomes very hard for you to get chosen.
That's a
I just
great
thought it was a
illustration.
very good, it has become increasingly relevant to at least my age group. second point is I was wondering, like, I think I can see why you can't just be true to yourself, but I also find it difficult to understand, to see how you can submit to God without some kind of self-knowledge as well. And I think you would even affirm that, like, you need there's like individuality is like affirmed. And I guess I was wondering if you could speak more on like the intersection of submission to God, but also being true to yourself, because it feels like both are kind of required.
Right, and I would concede there's a level of self-awareness that is required in order for you to know that you need God, but not the level of self-awareness where you know enough about yourself where you can ground all the decisions of life upon. So it's grounding versus knowing things about myself. So the gospel calls you to know that you are a sinner. To that degree, I have no problems knowing that knowledge. But as the basis by which I make all decisions of life and ultimately judge that decision by my knowledge of who I am, I don't think we'll ever get to that level. If you do introspection too deep, you'll never come out, because I don't know there's no bottom to reach to say, oh, now I know who I am, and then work yourself up. And the process is so fraught with biasness, how I want to see myself. So your first point, next time I do this, I'm going to put it in, right? That's great, dating app. And then to your second point, I would agree, knowledge about yourself, but never as the grounds by which you even decide. In fact, if I know I'm a sinner, ultimately I may have knowledge of my sinful actions, but the declaration of a sinner, I'm going to say it probably has to come from God, from Scripture. You are a sinner. Oh, I see that I'm a sinner as I am declared a sinner. But we'll have to work on that, but there is a degree of self-knowledge. Yes.
Oh, well, thank you. Have you ever seen this episode of The Twilight Zone where it's called A Nice Place to Visit?
Yep.
It's brilliant. It's a bank robber who dies, and then this guy takes him to where he's going to go. And he thinks he's in heaven because he gets everything he wants, all the food he wants, and gets gambling, he constantly wins. And it starts getting really old. He says, I don't think I'm cut out for this place. I'm cut out for heaven. Take me to the other places. What makes you think this is heaven?
Yeah.
This is the other place.
That's great. That's
It's
great.
so fascinating.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Andrew, did you want to say something?
Yeah. So about it's true that we kind of like in this modern world we often think about freedom as if it were in itself like as many choices as you have. The more choices you have, the better. And it's good that we poke that balloon, right? So, but then again, I think there's also that how we as Christians, we ground ourselves in God, right? That's our anchor. But to the rest of the world, they might say, well, you anchor yourself there, but we don't agree with you that that's the right anchor, right? So I guess I don't know what I want to ask about that.
Open it up. Yeah. What is Andrew asking or thinking? And then,
Ask this question and then answer it.
yeah.
Yeah, what should be our attitude to that when the rest of the world comes to pass and says, I don't agree with you that should be the anchor for our society, because that's that's a raging argument right now. But it's not just now. I think this goes way back, right?
Right.
Like we don't agree with you that should be the anchor. So how do we address that? What should be our attitude as Christians?
How do we help people to see that grounding in God is the better way to live our lives?
That's a better way to put it. Yeah.
Okay, and I would open it up to you, and then the third segment of this series will focus on present the gospel, respond to common objections, and how to be persuasive. But this will be a great time to share that if relevant to the theme.
Well, I think you can always share your opinion, and people need to respect your opinion on why you believe in what you believe and why your grounding is Christ. And they could share their opinion with you, but if you're very strong in your grounding, it's not.
Maybe it's not on an individual basis, you could do what you're saying, right? But maybe more on as a form of the argument that's going on more nationally, right? That's been happening. Like,
There's different organizations that take different stances, and you can do donations, you can go to the meetings, sign petitions, call your senator.
I mean, ultimately, it's gonna come down to an individual you're talking to.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you can see it if you're looking at the younger generation, like Charles brought up stuff about kids. I mean, you have kids, and they're always changing, and it's emotional, feelings, all that stuff, social media. So, like Charles said, I mean, and we're not talking about young kids, we're talking about 20s, 30s. They don't know who they're looking for when they want a job, when they're looking for a mate, what house to buy, car, whatever, and it is very true that you could say they're paralyzed because there's too many choices, even jobs. But like at this point, I mean, we've always educated kids for jobs that don't exist yet, but now it's broadened up in the last 10 years that it's unimaginable. And so like you're raising these kids who like, I don't know what college I want to go to, I don't know what interests me, I don't know where I'm going, I don't even know where I'm gonna eat the next day, and you're telling me all these things I have. It's very difficult. So as adults, we see the same thing. Where do you get your wisdom from? Because we ourselves are still growing, changing. We also make mistakes all the time. And I think that's how you find it is through experience. You know that you also need a higher, person who knows what's going on, or who knows you better. They're the same. They haven't maybe learned from that yet, or seen that, or they don't know what the truth is. You have to show them that this is how you do it, or this is where you get it from. Because I have 7th graders who 180 degrees different in 30 minutes. I mean, like, so you can't tell them the truth because they don't know what it is, and even if you told them, they wouldn't be able to notice it. So they just have to kind of see it, figure it out for themselves, and we have to model it. Yeah.
Modeling it.
Maybe, yeah.
I'm thinking about the story of the Samaritan woman. Kind of like, to try to kind of think about your question. When she met Jesus and had a conversation, and when she came to that point, like, wow, he may be the Messiah. And when she came to that realization after her conversation with him, she ran into the town and told everyone, saying, I think this man that I met, who told me everything about my life, isn't he the Messiah? And then it was the townspeople, by her words, came and had encounter with Jesus personally. That brought them to the faith to a level where they said, it is not because of just what you said now, but now we really believe. I think as Christians, I don't think we are called to convince people through rational, logical, like debates or any, like, I think those might be helpful in removing some of the stumbling blocks that come to Christ. But I think it's ultimately, in my opinion, it is about my redemption, what God has done in my life that I could share. And I don't even like to say modeling, because modeling almost sounds like I'm doing it like intentionally, but rather just sharing my life. That's why I think I really value like making the space to just share our lives and just learning what is my life about and how does my story fit into the overarching redemption story of God. And just sharing that and giving them opportunity and bringing them to church or other opportunities that would help them to slowly, like really like hear about Christ, and what He has done, because I think at the end it is the work of the Holy Spirit that really brings people. So that's what I have to say. Chris?
Yep.
I'm sorry, Clement had his hand
Oh,
up.
yeah. My comment was based on what you talked about it just in your presentation. Freedom is in a way you can choose whatever you want to do. But I'm trying to quote from one of the TV series. It's called The Blue Heart, The Blue Blood. The commissioner was telling his son, the detective, to treat people with respect, okay? To let them choose whatever they want to do. But the police commissioner told the son, the detective, ask them, are they doing the right thing? Okay? Just like you said in the presentation, the kid is too young to make his own decision or her decision to have a sex change. But are the parents, did they guide the kids to do what is the right thing? So America is freedom, is a big problem here. And the younger generation, the older generation, some of them, they don't even know what they are doing. So this is a good thing to learn from the religious perspective, and you try to commit, okay, yourself to be slave, to be truly faithful, to believe in God. Okay? This is my comment.
Thank you. And, don't get me wrong, I love living in a country where there is freedom, negative freedom, and the freedom to worship, in other words, to move forward. But, yeah.
I think you had a comment or two, no?
Good.
Chris?
Isaac.
Sorry.
Yes, in regard to the dating app.
That's stuck in your mind.
I recommend that maybe Costco come up with one. No, I think your point about the truth will set you free, the enslavement to Jesus Christ, your self-knowledge. If you don't know yourself, like someone said, even adults don't see themselves clearly when they look in the mirror. I think the closer you get to the Holy Spirit and to your God, things start to surface that, like for example, I shared this with you, right? I was buying lottery tickets every pay period, right? I say, oh yeah, I need more money, but then I started realizing, wait a minute, what? Aren't you happy with what you have? It was speaking to me, and I've stopped. Earlier in the year, maybe something you said, or just in the Bible, whatever the case may be. I think that whole thing about setting yourself, I feel liberated in that sense.
Right.
So,
Restricting your freedom.
right.
Chris, I think the only thing I said is we get 10% if you win. That was all.
I'm not sure, I came in a little late earlier, but was it addressed about the opposite, where some people don't have a choice to make a choice? Even though there's a freedom, maybe they're economic or, social or some
Right.
situations preventing them from making a choice. They have to be like a bus driver, or
Right.
they have to do something, or they don't have a car, they have to, take another transportation. They can't make that choice.
That's a great
How
point.
does that, fall into?
There are environmental factors that make certain options less likely.
Right.
Yeah, and that's why when you read that Isaiah Berlin quote, he includes poverty in there, because that may be a form of oppression where they don't have as many options as someone born into a well-to-do, educated parents. So it's not just black and white. There are many factors that are involved. Thanks for bringing that up.
I think that's for another course sermons. I was listening to it. That's where another course sermon comes in. I think that's where we kind of share in Christ's suffering,
Mhm.
right? You look at your circumstances, you cannot change it. But then you say, I unite my suffering in Christ. Right? That helps you understand better, you know, what my humanity is all about.
Right, right.
So,
Yeah, so there you go. What my humanity is all about. What am I? See?
and to be grateful for what we have.
Yeah.
Actually. You're a bus driver, sure. But would you rather be like, there are people that come from the Philippines, are people who live in the landfill. They build their houses there. And that's the only way they can make a living, right? So what about them? They have to, what hope do they have to look forward to? Again, Romans. That's their comfort, right? Unfortunate as it may be, right? But yeah, I guess the circumstances you may not be able to change,
Right.
but your attitude, and together we have the realization that there's God always walking along with you. That does make a difference. Not saying that we shouldn't try to change the situation, right, of course, but
And that's the beauty of the Christian faith is that we see our environment as in the hands of God, so that it's part of His plan for us in terms of our spiritual growth and what He's calling us to do. So we can see it intentional rather than just human forces that's creating that sense of oppression. Thank you for all the sharing. Yeah.
Yes, super quick. So connected to the things that we were saying at the beginning. So when we share our message with others, I think it's also important to know the person individually, the person that you have in front of you, if the circumstances allow. So the person may not fit the individualistic culture we're talking about, may have its own, surely has its own needs, problems, wishes, things that go well, things go wrong, and that can help on two levels. One, on modulate our message. Like Jesus often did in his meetings with people, he responded to the specific person in front of him, not deliver a list of propositions, he called person per name and so on. And second, may also open an opportunity, as far as we can, for us to create some bond that go with that person to show in practice how we live the specific message we would like to share.
That's a great point to end on, that in any encounter, relational encounter, the goal should be to understand and to know them. The last thing I would want is for you to take this and say, oh, he's individualistic. That means he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, we're stereotyping them rather than learning how they are individual in their thoughts on individualism. Just like if someone says, oh, you're a Christian, I know everything about Christianity, and then stereotyping. There are so many variations of Christianity. I would like them to talk to me to find out what I individually hold. And so, yeah, that was building relationship, creating bonding avenues. And at the end of the day, for us, it's really not about conversion. It's about relationship. God will do the converting through the relationship. So thank you, Mateo. Let me pray, and then we'll go downstairs. And Father, thank you for this time of sharing and being able to learn from each other and our thoughts, and perhaps to get to know each other through the questions and answers. And we're so grateful for the body that contributes to its own growth. And we trust, Father, that you will use this body so that it will be enlarged by inviting others within, that they might see the thing they long for the most, to be loved, can only occur in the truest sense through you, O God. And may we be the hands and feet that demonstrate that kind of love to those who we invite. So, Father, as we go through this series, the last thing we want is for people to walk out with a bunch of knowledge. We want our hearts to be changed, and more than that, our lives to be changed, so that we may model what it means to be truly, freely enslaved to you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thank you, everyone. We are done.
Yes.